I see a lot of golfers trying to work on shoulder rotation with the smart ball. I've spoken about drills like this in the past. I'm not using the smart ball now, but it's an alternative, right? So everybody knows, and these are things that I've mentioned, like I said, online, of the trail arm, the way it folds, internal rotation versus external rotation will play a huge influence on the shaft movement, and it does. Assuming all the other variables in your swing remain the same, right? If I internally rotate my shoulder, which you can think of it as like winning an arm wrestling match, versus if I externally rotate the shoulder, which you can think of it as losing an arm wrestling match, those two movements will play a huge role on the shaft, right? So if I get the right elbow getting caught behind the body and there's a separation of arm structure and I'm internally rotating the shoulder, I'm going to steepen the shaft in the downswing. Well, if I externally rotate it, right, and I get the arms coming a little closer together, the right elbow's pushing into the left elbow in my case, right? So trail elbow pushing into the lead elbow, that will externally rotate the shoulder, and that movement will influence a more shallow shaft. And in theory, that is 100% correct, assuming all the other variables remain the same. Now, what I tend to see every now and again, and this relates to a lot of players, yourself included, is that the trail arm actually works into a pretty good position, but the problem is that it's not the trail arm that is causing the shaft to stay vertical, it is the wrist angles that you carry. Now, there's a lot of different wrist angles that every golfer can have, okay? So there's flexion and extension, which we talk about a lot, right? So flexion would be curling the hand in, extension would be hinging it up and out this way, right? So those two movements will influence the club face more closed and more open, among other things, obviously. But there's also radial and ulnar deviation. So the way that you look at that is think about like the vertical hinging of the club versus casting it. So the vertical hinging is known as radial deviation, okay? That tends to keep the shaft very elevated. It's a very like lag style narrow look, right? Golfers who try to retain a lot of lag in their golf swing, they'll tend to be in a ton of radial deviation. Or there's that ulnar deviation, which is like the casting of the club, right? So it's almost like casting a fishing rod. That will be the unhinging of it. That'll be ulnar deviation. When golfers get to the top, if you're trying to work on shallowing the club and you have the arms working the right way, so it's not as though you're separating the trail elbow behind your body and you're coming down steep. If you have the elbow working in the appropriate direction, but instead of the shaft shallowing, you're doing it, and the shaft is still coming down vertical like this, would be a good example, right? Very internally rotated shoulder. I am externally rotating it, but the shaft angle is not shallowing out. Well, in that scenario there, more often than not, what's taking place is the wrist angles are retaining too much radial deviation. So essentially what's happening is you're retaining too much of that vertical hinging, and that keeps the shaft very elevated. Take a look, right? In order for the club head to drop behind your body, you cannot have that radial deviation, that vertical hinging, because if you have too much of it, it keeps the club head very up in the air, and that'll keep the shaft angle very upright naturally. So the pitch of the shaft is going to be very steep coming down, even if you're externally rotating the trail shoulder, right? So you see that here coming down. Still an issue. So what's happening is with those golfers, I mean, they can work on any smart ball drill they want where they get to the top. And if you can do this, well, that's great. But if you are externally rotating the trail shoulder, but the shaft angle is staying very upright and you're still keeping the ball between your arms, well, that's not a trail arm issue. That's a wrist angle issue. In that scenario there, this golfer needs to feel the unweighting of the club head behind them and getting rid of that radial deviation. Now, a lot of golfers think when you do this that you are removing a lot of the energy you're storing, right? Obviously, a big power accumulator is obviously the hinging of the wrist angles, right, in one direction or another. Well, keep in mind, there's a lot of ways to store energy, right? Yes, you can have this like lag type look, but the steep shaft creates way more problems than it helps. Well, what happens if you remove the radial deviation, but you have a lot of flexion? You're still going to have that 90-degree angle between the lead arm and the shaft. The only difference is instead of it being upright where you're coming into the golf ball really steep, it's not going to be upright. You're going to have more ulnar deviation, which is the unhinging, but you're going to have flexion. So it's still going to be hinged. It's just going to happen in a more shallow position, more behind your body. And with that flexion, it'll also come with good club face conditions more often than not. And this way, now you have a lot more rotational freedom, right? So if your trail arm is getting caught behind your body, well, that's a problem. But if the trail arm is not and it's moving externally, but you are not shallowing the club, well, that's a wrist angle problem. And this wrist, instead of having so much of this vertical hinging radial look, it's got to be removed into more flexion and ulnar, right? Like this. So the scientific terms would be ulnar deviation and flexion, and that'll get the shaft angle flattening out behind you with that good trail arm pattern. So this is something that we're going to need to discuss today